Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Hartman, and I want to welcome you back to our Alzheimer's Support Community channel. Of course, if you're new, we welcome you here. If you're coming back, we appreciate you viewing the content. And as always, we hope it makes a difference with your journey with a loved one who has Alzheimer's disease. And particularly on this video, I'm really excited. We have a guest on tonight. I'll tell you a little bit about him and then allow him to introduce himself. His name is John Duacek, and John and I were actually classmates in high school. And, you know, like things do in life, he went one way, I went another, and we had fallen out of touch. And then when I posted one of our videos on Facebook, John reached out to me in the chat to let me know that, you know, he really appreciated what I'd gone through because he went through the same thing with his wife, who, you know, unfortunately passed of Alzheimer's at a very young age in her 50s. And, you know, as John was sharing that with me through chat, he said, you know, I'd love to come on, and I'm more than happy to share about my journey with my wife. And for me, it was a real opportunity because most people, including myself, you know, my dad was 88 years old, almost 89 when he passed of Alzheimer's. We tend to look at it as a disease that affects old people. And while it mostly does, the unfortunate part of it is, and you know, they refer to it in the medical community as early onset Alzheimer's, but there's people as young as in their 40s getting this disease. So, you know, I really wanted John to be on to share another perspective, and somebody who was a caretaker and, you know, dealt with this disease with somebody very near and dear to him, his wife. So, John, if you would, you know, feel free to share a little of your background and your story, and then, you know, tell us a little bit about, I think it'd be best to start with people about, like early on as your wife began to come down with it and things you began to notice, but, you know, feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, I'm John Duacek, and like Greg said, we went to high school together. So you've got that background. As far as the Alzheimer's and my wife, we were both living up in the cities in Minneapolis, and she got diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2013, and about 3 years later, she passed away. She was 57 when diagnosed. It progresses very fast a lot of times when you're younger. I consider it young, but a devastating thing to go through, watching your loved one degenerate slowly over time. Nothing you can do about it. The Alzheimer's drugs at the moment don't slow it down. They just make it easier to handle in some cases. The caregiving was new to me. I had been a cabinet maker for 18 years, you know, working hard every day, and of course my wife worked. One day she got lost on her way home, and that's how we knew something was wrong to start with. And then you go through a long list of tests with doctors, and finally you end up with a neurosurgeon, and thankfully I ended up with a fantastic neurosurgeon or neurologist who helped us, and she was diagnosed rather quickly. Even that process is really tough on the person that's been diagnosed. The testing is rather brutal for them, just because it's all cognitive and they're having the cognitive problems, and it really shakes them up when they can't do simple things that they've used to do, understandably. So getting through that process alone was pretty monumental, and just the shock of coming to the realization that Alzheimer's, especially at a younger age. It just seems kind of crazy. But when the doctor looks at you and says, "Get your affairs in order," that was a clue that it was going to move fast. And I wish that would have been spelled out a little bit clearer. But wow, I didn't expect 3 years. She went, as a vibrant woman, very smart individual, to somebody all of a sudden they look like they're 90 when they're by the time they're passing away, and of course the mental faculties are gone at that point. My situation was hard. I took care of her by myself in more of a rural area. Uh, didn't have a lot of help until the end with hospice. Thank goodness for hospice. But all in all, it was a tough situation. I wouldn't recommend doing it in an area where you don't have help from family and things by yourself, because not only is it hard for the person with Alzheimer's, but it's from a caregiver point of view, extremely difficult thing to go through, and for anybody, even if you have help, as Greg can tell you there, it's very difficult.
Yeah, John, I want to get into the caregiving a bit, but when you and I first reconnected, when you reached out to me and then we talked a bit, we were talking about, and my dad's progressed much slower, right? His was 12, 14 years. But we talked about those initial stages, like that first time your wife didn't, lost her way home from work, right? And it was like my dad, the first time, I'll never forget, we were having a coffee at a Starbucks and I poured my heart out to him. I was transitioning careers and it was a really monumental time in my life. And I poured my heart out to him for 20 minutes. And then when he got done, he took a sip off his coffee and he looked at me and said, "So tell me, son, how's your job going?" Did he not just hear what I'm going to tell? It was really weird to me. Like, were you not listening? Because he didn't wear hearing aids. So I'm like, but it was like, were your hearing aids turned off? It was really weird. But talk a little about that process with your wife, because particularly at such a young age, it's not something we even think about or want to look for, right?
Exactly. And I was surprised I didn't realize something was going on sooner. People tend to, when they get it earlier or at any age, those first stages, they very well at covering up cognitive issues, like deciding not to balance a checkbook anymore, little things like that. I've done it for years. It's your turn to do it now, that type of thing, which seems quite normal, right?
Right. Yeah, at that moment, it makes sense to you, so you don't dig in a bit. It's like, oh, I can understand that, honey. I'll take on a checkbook now, right?
Sure. And then it's just everyday discussions. All of a sudden, you'll have a discussion, and you'll go in the other room, and maybe an hour later, something comes up, and uh, they ask you the question again, and you said, "Well, I told you this," and all of a sudden they're saying, "Well, no, you've never told me that." And in all honesty, they totally believe that. So you think something's going wrong with yourself. I was ready to go get checked out before she got lost on her way home, to tell you the truth, because I thought I was having problems.
Amazing.
Yeah, because you swear you tell somebody something and they look at you completely like, no.
Right.
It's little things like that were really difficult to pinpoint before something major happens, like you sitting with your dad or Maureen not finding her way home. And then you realize, wow, and then you tend to see stuff, hindsight, you know. It's a tough call.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say about the hindsight because once a little after that incident over the coffee, and at the time my dad had a partner, her name's Betty Lou, and I said to Betty Lou, I said, something's up with Dad. I know we think he's been forgetful and flaky, but I just poured my heart out to him. He didn't remember a thing. Like something's not going on, and that's when we took him in for medical care. He got checked out, and they put him on that drug Aricept, which is supposed to help. Whether it did or not, who really knows? Because and maybe it did slow down the progression for him, but it wasn't long after that he stopped driving because Betty Lou, and even though I think, from where he lived to the grocery store was a mile, right? But it was literally like, Betty Lou began to notice she would have to sit in the passenger seat and say, okay, turn here, turn here. And it was a drive he had done, John, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And all of a sudden she found she had to literally give him directions to do a 1 mile drive from the grocery store he'd been going to for 20 years to home, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My wife used to bake a lot. Well, boy, that stopped. And I didn't catch on to that. She told me she was tired of it. Well, she couldn't follow the recipes.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm really surprised they didn't catch on to it earlier at her work because obviously her work was being quite affected by it.
How did you both
Well, go ahead, Sid.
how did you both deal with as the progression got worse, just to keep mentally sane for yourself and trying to keep yourself positive under a tough circumstance?
Greg, would you like to go
Yeah,
first?
I'll go. And Sid, did I know I was talking about John at the beginning and setting things up. Did I reintroduce you? Because I don't think you've been on our video since we launched the channel. Um,
Uh, that's okay, Greg. I'm part of the team. I'm here to cheer
yeah,
you
so
on.
good. So I apologize for that, Sid. And you're probably wondering, who's this other guy with the blue shirt on? Well, those of you that maybe didn't see the first video we did when we launched the channel, um, Sid's been a dear friend for years, and this channel is actually his idea because he has his own YouTube channel. By the way, I'll do a shout out for it. It's called Sid's Tips, and Sid reviews all these great products and anything from nutritional products, exercise products, gadgets around the house. It's really great. So, you can go to his YouTube channel and look, and if you're thinking about buying something before you do, go to Sid's channel and check it out because he's got a lot of good tips and reviews. But anyway, since he had all that facility in quote being a YouTuber, he said, I really think your dad's story and what you went through about Alzheimer's, and of course why John is on tonight, would make a difference for people. Would you be willing to put it up on YouTube? And I was initially like, I'm not a YouTuber. I don't know that. And Sid said, all you got to do is get in front of a camera and talk, and I'll handle everything else. And that was kind of like a deal I couldn't refuse. So, here we are, and we're doing videos, and, it's good to have Sid on. And I'll make sure, he and I are on together every once in a while, so he's not always just in the background. So having said all that, Sid, and now formally introduce you, ask me the question again, John.
So, as you were going through the process for your father and your wife, and trying to keep mentally sane through this, what was emotionally like for you, as people start having to go through that, and just to try and keep positive all under a tough circumstance.
Yeah, it's and John mentioned it, and I'll let him, of course, tell his story. But I think it was probably rougher on him being rural and not having a lot of people around.
Yeah.
For me, I had my older sister Denise, who's a therapist, so I always had not just somebody that could listen, but after spending her whole adult life as a therapist, they learn to listen a particular way and, listen in a way that you can get everything out and kind of unload it and get complete with it. So that made a huge difference for me. But, you know, there were times I tried to tough it out. You know, and John and I talked about all the things. I thought maybe it was just dad because I'm old, but we actually got to see in each other's stories that no, that's actually the disease at work. It has nothing to do with age. Like dad would get upset and throw things, try to hit me, try to bite me, all of these kind of things. And there's some days that were really tough, like, you know, where you almost wanted to lash out back at them just because of the frustration and the wear on you. And, you know, I'll let John tell, you know, his experience because he and I didn't talk about this, but there were days dad would be in like great spirits for days on end. And then there'd be a bad day, then maybe back to a good day. But then there'd also be days where he'd be cranky or in a bad mood for days on end. And those really start to wear on you because it's kind of like those of you that are listening that have been parents, it's like dealing with a sick child or an upset child that, you know, it's you love this person and they're not feeling well and they're cranky and they're in a bad mood. And after a while, it begins to wear on you. So for me, it was the support of my sister, my brother, other family members, and then I, in the last year and a half, had hospice, and they give you support through not only the nursing care, but they had, you know, a counselor that would come to the house once a week and sit down and talk to me. And so I had that support too. But Sid, it's funny because when John and I were talking, he said to me, you know, even though I love my wife and I chose to take this on, I wouldn't recommend anybody take it on. Like it's that taxing of an activity. And I actually feel the same way. You know, I love my dad and he made us kids promise that we wouldn't lock him away in a home. And, you know, since I promised that to my dad, you know, I wanted to honor that. And so it was just, you know, you do what it takes. In fact, that was one of my dad's saying. He used to put his arm around me and say, son, sometimes your best just isn't good enough. Sometimes you just got to do whatever it takes. You know, and caring for him was one of those times. So John, share like how that your answer to that question and how that was for you.
Yeah. You know, in the beginning, when she was first diagnosed and trying to figure out, just trying to figure out the doctor's appointments, where to find help, what information is out there, and balancing work. You're so busy that I don't think it's hit you yet. And then as things progress a little bit further, and I had to quit my job to take care of my wife full time. And then we had to sell our house and move to something more affordable, so financially I could take care of her not working. When your whole identity is, you know, well, what do you do for a living? Everybody asks you that first.
Right.
So you always identify that, and all of a sudden, well, what do I do? I'm a caregiver, you know, and so that was emotional from my standpoint of view. And then just the stress and trauma of as you progress through it, your loved one, you know, Maureen hallucinated a lot, so she'd be talking to 6 people in the room that weren't there. It was tough watching all this. It tore you apart inside, but of course, you know, you keep a lot of that bottled up because you don't want to cry in front of them. They're having a tough enough time the way it is, and there's moments of clarity too, and that's rough too for them. So you're taking all this on, and you know, it got to the point I couldn't leave my wife to go to the mailbox even. So it's very intense, and um, it's a tough deal. There was times where she'd be awake for 72-hour stretches, and you couldn't sleep. You had to stay awake with this person because um, they're sort of like a giant raccoon. They're into everything all the time, and you never know what crazy thought they're going to do. Um,
Yeah.
it's tough. It's real tough. So I think it the further it progresses, the harder it is emotionally, and it tears you up. To be honest with, at the end, I was quite messed up. You know, I was just afraid. I was like a raw nerve. Um, Thankfully, I've done a lot of healing since. I miss my wife every day. Don't get it wrong. I loved her so much. We had a great relationship, and I think that's, well, that makes it even harder, I would think. So that's sort of my thoughts on, on dealing with it. I guess everybody's going to deal with it in their own way. Um, Talking with her sister a lot on the phone, that helped me when I was, you'd have frustrated, you get frustrated. Well, you end up having certain people you call when you're frustrated that understand, aren't going to pass judgment on you, know that they know that you're doing your best. So I think having some support of some kind is a must.
Yeah.
Wow.
And John, I love what you said because, um, the amount you gave up is incredible. And just like I shared with you, I had to reorganize my company and put additional burden on my business partner. And, there's all that stuff that um, is a huge sacrifice. And, it was really great to connect with you because, like I said, my dad's quote about just sometimes you just got to do what it takes. So I did that. And when you and I were talking, I really got to see how much I had to alter my life and actually sacrifice things to do that. And I don't think people will ever really appreciate that, because unless you've done it, it's hard to really know. And even if you've done it, like I maybe have a little bit more insight into your sacrifice and what it took because I had my version of that, but my version of it isn't your version of it, and like I didn't have to, you know, quit a job and then sell a house. I had to reorganize a business so it brought me less income, but still some. Um, so, the circumstances are different. And unfortunately, I think that's why so many people, if they have the financial resources, just opt to quote lock their, you know, parents or loved ones away in a care facility, which is a shame. I walk in the morning and sometimes I listen to music, sometimes I listen to nature, sometimes I listen to podcasts. And I like listening to podcasts when I walk. It's kind of my study exercise time early in the morning. And I like to listen to this guy. His name is Ben Greenfield, and his podcast is Ben Greenfield Fitness. And he's a biohacker, and he's into all these youthful and life extension techniques of all sorts, from saunas to nutritional products to exercise to anything. And he had an Indian guy on the show, and he was doing the podcast from his house. And the guy's a billionaire, right? And he's into all this cutting edge anti-aging science. And so they start out the podcast, and he's, from East India. And he says to him, the thing I've noticed about you is how much you've changed as a dad and how much you love your family. And then they had this conversation about family. And it got into, when people age and what do you do with your parents and all of that. And the Indian guy said, it's funny, in America, it's just so normal for all of you to stick somebody away in a nursing home And if you did that in the culture I come from, you would be shunned. Like if people found you weren't caring for your parents, you would send them out to some facility, you would lose your community and all your friends. You would be a bad person for doing that. So it was interesting to hear that. And they both agreed, like, well, isn't that what family's about? And don't we need more of that in America? And then they got into this whole philosophical conversation of, gee, maybe part of why the country's the way it looks is because people don't even care enough to take care of their own loved ones. How the heck are they going to take care of their next door neighbor, right? Or the person down the street or whatever. So, I was on my walk in the morning and I got moved to tears by this podcast, the two guys talking, because it really hit me. It kind of brought up, everything I went through with Dad, and it really hit home to me, like that struggle. But yet, if I look back, and you may feel the same way, John, I wouldn't have done it any other way.
Yeah.
And depending on your belief or faith or belief in spirituality, but I know my dad's at rest somewhere and he's proud of his son. Glad I did what I did. I'm sure your wife feels, the same way about you and the sacrifices you made.
It's good you're getting emotional, Greg. And I call you guys heroes, really. It's just really big pats on your back. Amazing to hear your stories. I remember as my grandmother, towards the end of her life, I think she also had Alzheimer's or just was sadly losing her memory, and she would call me her nephew, and it's hard to see a loved one, start really losing it. And, when talking about losing it, do you remember like that last conversation where they could understand, I've got Alzheimer's, my memory's going? Is there any comprehension? Do they understand that? And then, they know something. What's that?
For me, it was not really one last conversation. You have many last conversations, I think,
Yeah.
because you have moments of clarity here and there. Towards the end, less, of course, but we always said when she would ask me, do I have Alzheimer's or what's happening, and we'd talk about it, and of course she'd be a little depressed, and I'd say, well, are you still finding joy today in some way? So it was always my goal to at least um, have some joy in her life every day, as much as I could, whether it just be silly songs or you know going for a walk in the early days when she was able to go for a walk, and just holding her hand, and she might, you see things through their eyes as it progresses too. I mean, just a, a leaf, she might pick up a leaf and just say how incredible it is, and you start looking at it and it's like, well, that is pretty incredible. So uh, it's quite a journey. It's a hard journey, but it's a journey.
Yeah.
Yes, and from my perspective, I don't know if my dad knew. It's kind of like John said with his wife, just stop baking or stop doing the checkbook, and said, I just don't want to do that anymore. And my dad was very much the same way. So I never could figure out, does he know this is happening to him and he's just wants to pretend it isn't, or he's in denial, or does he just not realize what's happening? And I could never quite figure it out with him, but it went the way it went regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up, John, because there were days that I really had a lot of fun with my dad and was clear that I brought him joy. And this was probably about a month, maybe 2 months before he died. But one of the blessings I had too is my mom passed from cancer in '06. And then they had retired with lifelong best friends here in St. Augustine, Betty Lou and Dick Kelleher. And Betty Lou's husband, Dick, had passed sometime between, you know, when my mom passed and, you know, then when Dad came down with Alzheimer's. So Betty Lou was a good friend, would check up on Dad. And of course, she lost her husband, Dad lost Mom. So they took up together, and I thought it was great. You know, now there was some different conversations in the family, but you know, that's just family doing their shit, right? And Betty Lou was a godsend and really loved my dad and lived with him and cared for him. And then, you know, when I took over, it was just because it finally got to be too much for her, right? But like all along, you know, we were the two caregivers. So Betty Lou was for most of the time the primary caregiver. And then when she would have to travel, I was living and working in New Mexico at the time. I would fly back for a couple weeks. You know, she was off with her family, grandchildren, etc. And I would be the primary caregiver. And so then when I had to take over full time, we kind of switched roles. So if I had a business trip I needed to take or somewhere I needed to go, Betty Lou was my backup, right? She would move into the house and care for Dad. So I went away for a long weekend. It was like a business conference. And I'll never forget, I had been caring for Dad long enough. And at some point had my brother move in to help. And apparently Dad was in a cranky mood all weekend, you know, while I was gone. He wasn't eating, he wasn't cooperating. And I'll never forget, I walked back in the house and I walked around the corner, and I don't think he knew who I was, like I'm Greg, his son, but I had been caregiving for him long enough. Like the minute I walked around in the corner and locked eyes with him, he just got this big smile on his face, you know? It was kind of like, oh, my buddy's back, right? And
Wow.
then after, you know, and then Betty Lou packed up her stuff and went back home, and my brother and I were sitting around talking, and he said to me, he said, it was the most amazing thing when you came home. He said, for whatever reason, Dad was cranky all weekend. Neither myself or Betty Lou could make a difference with him. And it was like, for some reason, when you walked in, he was like a changed man. And, you know, that's that connection that we can't figure out, but I'm clear it was there with me and Dad up until the moment he passed. You know, he didn't know me as Greg, his son, anymore, but he did know me as like, that's the guy that's my buddy or takes care of me or whatever I do. So it was really cool to see that. Like, even when their faculty is gone, there's still somehow a connection.
Yep, absolutely.
You both are brave men, and quite stories you shared.
There
Yeah,
are,
go ahead, John.
well, there's just some things that I think people should know if they're going to seriously thinking about caregiving. Just things like getting your paperwork in order, power of attorney, both medical and legal.
Yeah.
Those things you want to handle right away. Financials, you're going to have to figure out what to do with them, especially if you're going to be going on any kind of state aid. You're only allowed to have so many assets, but there's things you can do with a retirement account or whatever, so it's protected. You can throw in annuities or something like that. But find a financial person that's familiar with Alzheimer's or estates or something like that that can help you. And do that sooner than later, because some of them have a time limit, yet you have to do so many years ahead. It's things like that that you know, I had no idea And to find that information of what needs to be done was difficult at the time. Um, and programs that are out there, there are programs out there, more so for older people. I know Maureen didn't qualify for a lot of programs because she wasn't 65 yet. So, which made it harder, of course. But yeah, definitely get the mechanics of it set and even think far enough ahead as uh, they won't be able to walk well usually towards the end and things like that. Do you need to have a handrails put up in the bathroom, that type of thing? Are your doors wide enough if they do end up in a wheelchair or such? So just things to think about.
Yeah, we even had things like, my dad, if I took my eye off him for a second, he was trying to get out the front door to go home. I think his old beach house that he built, whatever shifted, he thought that was his house and this wasn't his house, so he would keep trying to leave. And I'd be like, Dad, where are you going? Well, I got to go home. I would be like, well, you are home. But, we played that game all the time. And finally, it got to the point, John, I had to put in a double-sided deadbolt on that door. So, and we put a little nail in and the key was above the door. So anybody with the facility knew how to unlock the door for, the UPS man or whatever. But it was, child-proof from Dad, so he couldn't get out. But I really appreciate what you said. Fortunately for me, my mom was pretty fastidious about that stuff, so most of it was arranged by her prior to her passing. And
Sure.
then kind of the things we missed after mom passed, we shored up after that. So that was all in place when dad started down the road. And thankfully, you know. But I think that's great advice to people because you got enough on your hands trying to care for this person. You don't need all that other stuff unraveling behind you because it just adds to the worry and the stress.
Yeah. But you're absolutely right about like the child locks and things like that. I mean, you've got to put away all your knives that are on the counters. You got to pull off the knobs on the stove, anything like that. They're
Wow.
like raccoons. They're going around,
Yeah, they are.
trying everything.
And the other analogy I use, they really are like a 2-year-old in an adult's body. I mean, it's right
Sure.
down to the changing diapers and everything else that you
Oh,
have
yeah.
to do. So if I guess it would be tougher for somebody who's never raised an infant to know what it's like to deal with a 2-year-old, but it's very much the same. You turn your back for a second, who knows
Sure.
what they're into.
Greg, you sure got creative from your videos that you've shared thus far. It is pretty amazing how creative you have to really get.
Yeah, John, we could talk about that a little bit. Like I've shared with Sid, and we've done some videos about keeping them safe and protecting them from themselves. But I constantly had to be one step ahead of dad. Like we turned his hospital bed into literally an adult-sized crib so we could keep him contained at night because he would try to get out. And the couple times he did before I figured out how to build a crib. Um, he fell and cut his head open, and then, due to other medical conditions, he was on blood thinners. So then, they bleed forever, right? If they're on a blood thinner. And the problem with Alzheimer's, you put a Band-Aid on, and it's a foreign thing. So people don't understand. You can't tell them leave the Band-Aid alone because that lasts for 2 seconds, and then they're like, "Oh, what's this?" And they start pulling at it again. So, I showed Sid some pictures of literally duct tape on Dad because I had to put on a Band-Aid, then wrap the Band-Aid with gauze, and then duct tape the gauze on so he couldn't pull it off. And I remember the first time my sister saw that, it's like, what are you doing with duct tape on Dad? And I'm like, I'm protecting him from himself so that bandage will stay on long enough that his cut will scale up, you know?
Yep. Maureen used to crumple her glasses up, so went through a lot of pairs of glasses.
Oh boy.
But another thing was with me, medications. She didn't want to take any medications, so I had to get very creative about crushing them up, hiding them in food or ice cream or something. And then finally, hospice let me know that most medications come in liquid form.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh,
So,
wow.
and you'd think the doctors would have told me, but they're not thinking of that either. So it's little things like that that make a difference.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. Isn't it, even though your wife was much younger, one of the things, Sid, that John and I talked about is how much of the things people do are just the progression of the disease. Like you and I didn't talk about this beforehand, John, but I had the same thing with Dad. I was crushing pills, and he got smart enough that I couldn't even hide it in his food. He'd catch that. But finally, what I figured out with him, he loved Lucerna, the chocolate drink, right? That they make for, I think it's made for people with diabetes, but whatever. It's like a chocolate protein drink. So I would grind up the meds and I would mix it in his Lucerna and he'd drink it right down. Never knew the difference. And that used to be our joke. And that's how we would get him sleeping meds at night. And he would always take us and he'd go, "Oh, this is really good." I don't know if his joke would be, "Dad, it's even better than you realize," because it had the meds in it, right? But you do learn those tricks.
Absolutely.
Good stuff.
Well, John, it's been a pleasure having you on. I kind of want to, give you a chance if there's anything last minute you want to share with people and then wrap it up. And then, as Sid and I progress in the future, if I come up with things, we'd love to have you back on just to keep sharing your, experience and your journey for people. Because, maybe one of the things we could talk about is, because you and I talked about this, is the after they pass and the healing journey and kind of getting back into life, because it's a weird process when your life has been 24/7 consumed by this other people and all of a sudden that's all over. Almost, and you and I talked about this for both of us, it's kind of like, wow, now what do I do?
Absolutely. Um, is that something you want to do for another talk, perhaps?
Yeah, we'll say that for another time. I think that'd be a great conversation
Yeah.
for people,
And perhaps people, can come up with a list of questions or anything like that. I'd be more than willing to come back and share any insights that I may have. I don't know if I've been any help, but I hope I have.
Yeah, well, I'll ask people to that. On YouTube you can make comments, so feel free to type in some questions for John and I, and we can get back on another time and address those questions. And then I want to wrap up by, first, Sid, thanking you again for the idea to even do this, because I think it's good information to get out to people. And then, John, is somebody that's been through the path, we knew each other as, teenage boys in high school, and you never know how somebody's going to turn out, right? But I just want to say from me to you, brother, given what you did, I know the man that you are, and I'm really proud to call you a friend, given, what you did and who you are, because it takes a certain kind of person to give the way you did, and it really communicates to me so strongly about the man you are. I'm blessed to have you as a friend.
Greg, thank you. And I feel the same way. I think you're amazing, and I really appreciate that you consider doing this to help people.
Yeah.
It's needed. It really is. And thank you both so much.
Absolutely. And I'm glad, Greg, that I pushed you to do it.
Great. And
Yep.
everybody, thanks for listening. As I say at the end, I hope this contributed in some small way. And if you know people, please share the channel, share the videos. The whole reason we're doing this is to get information out that can support people, make a difference for them, and help us at least get a little handle on this terrible disease that so many families are dealing with now, and unfortunately probably more in the future. So with that, gentlemen, thank you both. Good night, and we'll see everybody soon. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Greg.